Spoilers ahead.
The Popstorian Podcast with Chris and Ben.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
Greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market.
A date which will live in infamy.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
What are you supposed to do when you see the flash? Duck and cover.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Might have gotten away with it, too. If it wasn't for these blasted kids and their dog.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The evil of the thriller.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
Great power comes great responsibility.
Ben?
Chris?
Are you there, Ben?
I'm here. Are you there?
I'm here.
These are exciting times we live
in. Such exciting times. Such technology availability to us.
Yes. Learning to podcast by distance.
Social distancing.
Podcast by social distance. I guess it's pretty normal for a lot of podcasts seem to record via distance, but it's not the norm for us. We like to be in the same room whenever we can be.
It's true. We do. Hopefully we will do that again.
Who are we? What are we doing here?
We are talking about the 1970s and a certain Western for this decade.
In our Westerns by the Decade series?
Hold on a second. Oh yeah, look! You look so pretty.
Oh, thanks, Chris.
Yeah. Alright, now, good night. Go to bed.
It has Cinderella, Jasmine, and Belle, and Hansel, and Ariel, and Cinderella.
It's amazing. Alright, night-night. You might have to edit that out.
No, it's totally staying in.
Speaking of social distancing. Anyway, we are on our 1970s episode of Westerns by the Decade. And our Western for this decade is...
High Plains Drifter.
High Plains Drifter.
Westerns by the Decade.
1973, directed and starring Clint Eastwood.
Now, we had to talk about Clint Eastwood at some point in this series. There was no way we could avoid it, because he's one of the, along with, William S. Hart, Tom Mix, John Wayne, he's one of those names that just is so completely linked forever with the Western genre.
Right.
We just couldn't not tackle some of his work. And in the 60s, we seriously considered talking about his collaborations with Sergio Leone, the Fistful of Dollars trilogy.
Yeah, but we couldn't avoid Peckinpah, and so
yes,
it was kind of a toss-up whether to do Peckinpah in the 70s and Eastwood into the 60s, but this is the way it worked out.
I'm ultimately glad that we went this way, for reasons that'll become clear as we discuss the film. But
okay, well,
there was some controversy because we initially picked The Outlaw Josie Wales.
That's right.
I think we even announced that on the air.
I think we did, and then we changed our minds on it.
Uh-huh.
The reasoning for that would be that I was under the impression that Outlaw Josie Wales was his first Western, I think. And I was kind of thinking, well, we're going to cover Clint Eastwood in Westerns. We should talk about his first directorial film.
Yeah.
High Plains Drifter is not his first film that he's directed. I believe it's his second.
Yeah. After Play Misty for Me.
Right. You're right. But this is his first Western that he has directed.
Yes.
So.
Yes, correct.
I figured this would be more historically important. Although Outlaw Josie Wales apparently is one of his more famous
Yeah.
famous works.
And I, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's better regarded critically.
Yeah.
But I do think the High Plains Drifter is a bit darker. Kind of my understanding.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes with some of the trends that were happening in the 70s. So I think it's more representative of the decade as a whole than perhaps the Outlaw Josie Wales might be.
That I would say that's probably accurate on that case, especially when you consider what's happening in 1973.
Yes. So that's my justification.
So that's why we did it.
So without further ado, should we delve into our usual ludicrous train goes off the rails kind of summarizing of what happens in High Plains Drifter?
Yes.
Okay, so in High Plains Drifter, it opens, and it's kind of a bleak, hazy day out in the Wild West. A man's riding across the plain, and he rides into this strange little town that's kind of on the side of a lake in I guess it's the plains or the foothills. It kind of looks like Utah, I think is where they shot it, I want to say.
I think so. I think it's filmed in Utah.
So it's a very kind of interesting landscape. Not exactly like far out in the desert, but definitely out west in a very like southwestern America landscape. And he rides into this town. He's a very mysterious stranger. He goes into the saloon. 3 men start to taunt him. And this hero, this mysterious stranger, isn't given a name, but he's played by star and director Clint Eastwood. So we know right away that he's who we're supposed to root for. And promptly, he leaves the bar when these 3 men, locals, start to challenge him. And he goes to get a haircut at the barber across the street. And this doesn't go super well because the 3 men follow him. But they underestimate him. And he gets the better of them, and in self-defense, or I guess you could say it's self-defense. Basically, he kills them, much to the terror of the town barber.
Yes.
So he just kind of like walks away. He doesn't get his shave, to the chagrin of viewers everywhere. Bumps into a woman in the street. And she doesn't take kindly to his rudeness, roughness, just general.
I think she just trying to call him out. I don't know. She's just trying to bait him, I think.
Now, is she aware that he just killed 3 people, or is she just like blissfully unaware?
I believe so, because she's introduced earlier in the film, or at least you see her as she rides into town.
Right.
And it's not like town is very large. It's not a very large town, so I'd imagine you hear 3 or 4 gunshots, you probably know what he did. Plus you can see the barbershop.
So, but I feel like it doesn't enter into their dialogue as much as you might expect.
It doesn't. It almost is like they're trying to show that she's attracted to him because of his manly toughness, I guess.
Right. But also, like, repulsed in a weird way?
I guess. I'm not sure on that one.
It's a bit of an oddity of a thing. So he's just blown 3 guys away, and he strolls out into the street, bumps into this woman. They get into a sort of altercation, and his response is to drag her off into a stable and rape her.
That's true.
And it's pretty unpleasant, but we can unpack that later.
Yeah.
He gets himself a room in the hotel, and that night he has a dream about a man being brutally whipped in the street of the town. And the man, I guess you could say, looks like him? It's not actually him, the man being whipped.
You do get the feeling in this dream that the town's not going to do anything for this town marshal.
Right. The man who's
Right.
being whipped is a town marshal. That's important to note.
So he wakes up from his dream, he goes out, and apparently everybody wants to talk to him because they're worried about the 3 guys that were doing the whipping in the dream are going to come back to town and wreak their revenge for the town who captured them and sent them to prison the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talked to by the sheriff, he's talked to by the mayor and the big businessman of the town. And
it's interesting. The town business is kind of they're kind of a mining town, I guess.
yeah, it's a mining town, which is right by the lake. So I'm not sure it's not near the mountains. I think.
Yeah, we don't actually see the mine.
Right.
So I don't know if they just they own it collectively as a town, and they hire people to work it, or because you never see anybody who's kind of like a foreman or anything. But it's kind of
That is
implied
true.
that
It's rather an ambiguous setup there.
There's a lot about this movie that's ambiguous. I'm realizing as I try to summarize it. It sounds confusing because we're talking about him having a dream, but it's also implied that the events in the dream are things that happened
in the past.
But that him being Clint Eastwood's mysterious character, didn't actually witness, as far as we know.
Right.
So he's dreaming about it, but he didn't witness it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the people in the town want to hire him like a gunfighter to kind of like be on their side and protect them from these outlaws who are getting out of jail.
And he kind of accepts.
He does, but not in the way that they want.
They said they give him unlimited credit. So he goes throughout the entire town, really just doing whatever he wants, grabbing whatever he wants, giving to whoever he wants. Mm-hmm. And they're like, okay, this is not going the way we want it to. But then you're as an audience, you're transplanted in by the prison, and you meet the bad guys.
And they are 3 very unsavory characters.
Yeah, you're introduced to them being kicked out of prison with no bullets in their guns, no horses. And then they, next time you see them, they're coming up on some guys apparently camping out in the middle of the woods. And they shoot them all dead and steal their clothes and their horses.
Where did they get the bullets from again?
Yeah, we couldn't figure that out when we were watching the movie either.
I think they left that part out. But suffice it to say, it was probably through nefarious means.
That's what you're led to believe, yeah.
They're not so nice.
So
they're kind of closing in on the town.
Right.
And our gunslinger is taking full advantage of the situation, trying to train the townspeople to defend themselves with very little success. It's a very poor operation, his kind of training operation.
Yeah, it seems to be the extent of it is them riding a wagon in the middle of the town, riding in a circle, and then trying to shoot watermelons off of it.
From the tops of buildings.
Right.
It's not, they make the bounty hunters from the Wild Bunch look like crack shots.
Yeah. So apparently the townspeople, or at least the leaders of the townspeople, get tired of this type of training and decide some way to get rid of Clint Eastwood's character. Apparently one group of people decide that they're going to try to kill him by blowing up the hotel.
But
well, well, I misspoke there. They don't actually try to blow up the hotel. They try to sneak up with him when he's asleep, and he blows up the hotel.
There you go.
There we go. We got it right. And please continue.
Yeah, they weren't quite fast enough to outsmart him. He knew that they were coming. So I guess he kind of doesn't trust them any more than they like him. So it's very very rough business. At some point, he decides he's going to take over the entire hotel, kick out all the residents / guests who live there. I think he tries to sleep with the hotel owner's wife, but I think he's interrupted before that actually happens. So
actually, he succeeds in that after the hotel is blown up.
That's right. You're right.
Yeah. Which is another kind of a weird interaction with women in this film, because she's apparently repulsed by him, but then he acts like she doesn't mean anything, and apparently that's enough to attract her, and so on. So, yeah, it's kind of some strange stuff.
Yeah, so that of course irks the rest of the townspeople and gives them all the more reason to want to get rid of him. So things are kind of coming to a head, but there's still the problem of the outlaws.
Right. So right after the hotel blows up, one of the ringleaders rides away. He gets away, and he ends up in the middle of a quarry, where of course the 3 bad guys are hiding out.
And I think he was wounded in his getaway.
You're right. He was shot. And so, before Eastwood's character goes out after him, he has the townspeople paint the town red. Literally red.
Every building.
And he paints on the sign, "Welcome to Hell."
Yes. The town's name was Lago. He officially, in his capacity as
gunslinger extraordinaire,
town protector, he changes the name of the town to Hell. I guess we should mention also the supporting character of Mordecai.
He does play a very big part. I do forget the character's name.
He's the actor's name is Billy Curtis.
Billy Curtis.
And he plays at the beginning of the story. He's kind of a drunk, I guess you could say.
Is the drunk and kind of the butt of a lot of jokes.
Yeah, he's a little man, so they kind of kick him around. And then the gunslinger makes him the mayor, and basically
the sheriff,
and makes him kind of the means of putting his will out onto the town. So by the mayor's orders, the town is painted red and Hell is painted on the sign.
Right.
They make a big picnic with food and drink. They paint a big banner that says "Welcome."
Right, and so Clint Eastwood's character goes out after the one guy, and kind of goes into a gunfight with the bad guys, though they can't see where he's at, and kind of just has them chase him into town. So that was his baiting them into town.
Right.
So they ride into town, and of course the townspeople freak out because Clint Eastwood's character is riding apparently out of town, away from the action, deserting them in their time of need. And then the bad guys roll in and make very little work of capturing the town.
Yeah, they pretty much round everybody up and shove them into the saloon after destroying the picnic.
Right, and set fire to a few buildings.
They're not too happy. But then, as the fire blazes, there's this whole movie, I should mention, there's kind of a eerie tone about it. And as the fire starts to burn and everybody's sequestered in the saloon and there's nobody, or our gunslinger, mysterious man, is nowhere to be seen, someone lashes out with a whip into the saloon, grabs one of the 3 outlaws by the throat with the whip and pulls him out into the street and begins to whip him savagely in the street, backed by flames. And we don't see who it is, but we kind of know that it's Eastwood's character.
And his the 2 bad guys that are left in the building kind of go out investigating, they find, I think Eastwood's character throws the whip inside the saloon.
After he's basically murdered this guy.
Yeah, and they go out.
So I guess they were too scared to go out.
I guess. I'm not sure. They don't
put a stop to it.
They don't really put a stop to it. They just kind of sit there listening to the whip.
Right.
Which, of course, by this point, you kind of understand the backstory that these three men whipped the town sheriff mercilessly, and none of the townspeople did anything about it because they were actually kind of hired to kill the town's sheriff marshal.
Mm-hmm.
Because the big surprise, the big twist is that these guys that have been hiring Clint Eastwood's character also hired these guys, and because I guess the marshal was not in on the whole corruption thing.
Right. So the kind of like scheme that's going on is that the townsfolk founded their mine on government land, so they don't actually they don't actually have any rights to any of the wealth that they've accrued. And the marshal, who was whipped to death in the street, discovered this, and was in order to prevent him from raining on their parade, they basically hire 3 thugs to kill him, and then they double-cross the thugs, send them to prison. Now the thugs are back, and this stranger seems to see through all of them and allows the 3 outlaws basically to come into town and punish them for their misdeeds. And then once they've done the dirty deed, he handily dispatches the 3 of them.
He does. He hangs the second one and then shoots the last one.
Yep.
And last one famously calls out, "Who are you?" And I believe he answers back, he's like, "You know who I am," doesn't he?
Something like that.
Something of that nature.
I don't remember what the exact words were, but it's basically that.
And then when it's all said and done, the sun rises, and Eastwood's character rides out into the sunrise, into the desert.
Where Mordecai is putting a marker on the unmarked grave of the marshal.
Right. So
he Mordecai says, "I never did know your name or who you are." And the stranger, Clint Eastwood's gunslinger, says, "Well, you know who I am." And as he rides off, the camera pans over to a shot of the tombstone to reveal the name of the marshal, Jim Duncan.
Right.
And that's the end of the movie. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Yeah, we forgot to tell him the spoiler alert. Anyway,
spoilers ahead. I'll put that.
One of the things that really stand out to me in this film is the ambiguity.
There is a lot of ambiguity.
What's going on in this movie? And who is Clint Eastwood's character is the thing that always jumps out at me. A lot of people automatically kind of jump to the conclusion that the Clint Eastwood character is, I guess, a ghost of the town marshal.
Yeah.
Which seems to make sense because he apparently has knowledge of what happened there in town. Yep. He sees through everybody's lies.
Mm-hmm. And there's kind of like an eeriness about it.
Yeah.
Sort of something about the score. The music is very unsettling, and there's kind of a haziness to it. The movie shot a lot of it outside on location. So there's there's a lot of like sun, like bright sunshine, but it's hazy and kind of dream-like or nightmare-like in the kind of like haziness. So the whole thing feels like it could be a ghost story. But it's not,
very much so,
not explicitly so. So you could easily make a case that it's not a ghost story at all, which only makes it more unsettling.
So if you go on IMDb and actually look at the credits of the film, the town marshal's actually played by another actor entirely.
Right, which I didn't realize when I was watching it. I thought it was Clint Eastwood.
It's hard to see in the dark and on the kind of the shadows that are playing over in his face.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to tell. I think when I was reading about this film, apparently at one point Clint Eastwood actually said that he played the character like it was the Marshal's brother.
Right, he did say that, yeah.
I don't know if I really like that answer, because how would his brother have dreams about how his brother died? That's kind of anyway.
Yeah, there's not a satisfying conclusion to it.
My theory, the theory that I like to think about this film.
Ooh, go on.
Because it's so ambiguous, you can kind of read yourself into this film. Is that Clint Eastwood actually plays the devil, which would explain why he is fascinated with calling the town hell and painting it red and interested in dragging evil men to their doom.
Right. That's an interesting interpretation.
I kind of like that theory, or that idea of it.
Is that original to you, as far as you know, or did you read that
somewhere? As far as I know, I did not read that anywhere, as far as I know.
I didn't encounter that in any of my research, but that's, that seems as good as any.
And it's used with the creepiness of the film.
Right, yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah, so it is a very ambiguous kind of idea. Another thing why we kind of selected this film is because the connection to Sergio Leone. Since we can't talk about Sergio Leone directly,
right?
This is the kind of one of the first films he does away from Leone.
One of the first westerns, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there's some of that kind of style in this film.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think before this, he pretty much only had Hang 'em High. Oh, that's not true. He also had Two Mules for Sister Sarah. But I think both of those are Don Siegel.
Right.
Or no, Hang 'em High is not.
Hang 'em High is not?
But he's pretty much coming out of the wake of working with these great master directors who helped him transition to his stardom from being a television actor to kind of becoming a cinematic icon. So there's a lot of motifs here that are very similar. There's the unnamed stranger, which is of course Clint Eastwood's character in A Fistful of Dollars and the subsequent movies in that series, is an unnamed stranger whose background is unknown. He's just kind of a drifter. We don't know anything about him. So that motif kind of comes through. There's also kind of like roughness and rawness. It's not at all a romanticized version of the West.
Right.
So that's an element that he, the kind of like dirt and gritty, but it's not as highly stylized, I think, as Leone's films are. There's not the kind of trademark whip pans or zooms, or he doesn't have quite the same flair for the dramatic. Instead, it depends more on ambiance. So I feel like he's trying to differentiate himself. But at the same time, if you didn't like westerns, I could see how you might get confused between this film and a Leone film.
Right.
Because they're on the surface level at least pretty similar, even though there's some interesting departures. Another kind of big mentor that Eastwood had as a director was Don Siegel, who directed him in Dirty Harry and a bunch of other pictures. I think they collaborated 5 or 6 times.
Well, there's like at least 5 Dirty Harry movies, so...
Yeah.
I don't know if Don Siegel did all of them, but...
5 Dirty Harry movies?
Yeah.
I think those are a mix. I think Eastwood directs some of them, and then after a while his friendship with Siegel kind of... they kind of went their separate ways. He started bringing in other directors to direct the Dirty Harry movies. But anyway, in the beginning, Siegel was very much an influence on Eastwood. So he picked up on a lot from those two filmmakers in developing his style. And this is pretty early on for him, so I think he's still finding his feet as a director. I think there's still a lot of a film that's very similar to this one that he makes later is a film called Pale Rider.
Yeah.
Which is a similar kind of a story. There's a bit of a revenge. It's a bit of an unconventional take on a revenge Western plot, which is not all that uncommon in the 70s. It's kind of a exploitation fare, a pretty typical exploitation movie story. But he manages to put his own edge on it. But Pale Rider, I think, is a superior film. It's much more developed, and he's much more at the peak of his powers as a filmmaker, I think, by 1985.
I think by that point he has pretty much found his niche as a director.
Yeah. And
As
this
well
at
as
this point is
doing
still very
westerns.
much developing.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. The visual motifs. I talked a little bit about the cinematography and the look of the town in general. The whole kind of mise en scene is very I don't know what the word is. It's very frontiersy,
Rustic.
isolated, but
That's
also
true, yeah.
also kind of like it's not a very big town. Like you can see from one end to the other and beyond into the kind of nothingness around them.
Very, very basic. You have a saloon, hotel, a barbershop, a jail. Kind of going way back into some of our earlier episodes talking about civilization meeting the frontier. There is a church being built, which I think is put there somewhat as an irony, considering the corruptness of the film,
Right,
of
yeah.
the characters in the film.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also painted red, by the way, at the end.
To the objection of the minister.
Of the minister, yeah.
Who also objects to the emptying out of the hotel before he realizes that he can make a quick buck off renting his own lodgings.
Yeah,
so he's
and I think
kind of portrayed as a hypocritical figure.
The hypocrite, yeah, and I think Clint Eastwood got a little bit of criticism for showing kind of such hypocrites and townspeople kind of thing. I think John Wayne kind of
John Wayne came out and definitely criticized the film publicly.
Yeah.
I don't think to anyone's surprise at that point. He became It's funny, he seemed to become even more conservative as he got older. Not that he was ever not conservative.
Well, John Wayne was a very conservative person, and he got, I think, more involved with politics as he got older.
Yeah. At this point, he'd already made a film called The Green Berets that was kind of pro-Vietnam.
Right.
And in a way, tradition, pro-American, pro-the American way. And pretty much supporting all the things that a lot of the youth movement, which was by and large the audience that was flocking to Sergio Leone's movies in droves, was against. So people kind of took sides, which I think is unfortunate because I think there's stuff you can learn from both points of view.
What is kind of interesting is that Clint Eastwood himself has kind of gotten a little more political
more conservative.
He's gotten older. Yeah,
as he's gotten older too.
And one of the debates between John Wayne and Eastwood was that John Wayne accused Eastwood of shooting bad guys in the back, shooting people in the back,
right?
Which is something John Wayne was very proud of that he never did in a film. He actually even rewrote the last scene of The Shootist so that he wouldn't have to shoot anyone in the back.
Right, yeah.
Before we go any much further, I did want to correct ourselves from earlier in the episode. This is being filmed in California.
Okay.
At Mono Lake, California.
Gotcha.
Originally, I think he wanted to do it in a lake in Nevada.
That's where I got confused.
Yeah, and he was not allowed lease of that land, so
gotcha.
He ended up doing it in California.
Yeah, he'd kind of, it's interesting at this point, it's 73 when this comes out. He's already kind of establishing himself with his own production company and taking control of his own things, which is kind of unusual for an actor turned director, but he was also interested in producing it and running it as a business. And he's kind of become more successful at that than almost anyone else in terms of actor turning director and running it successfully as a business.
That is actually really quite impressive. I mean,
it's very unusual.
By the time that he has done this film, he's been in the business for about 20 years.
Yeah.
He had been in a number of TV shows in the 50s.
Yeah.
Including Rawhide, which was his big break.
When did Rawhide start? I should know that.
Oh.
Pull that up.
I remember I saw it when I was doing research for the 1950s.
So did I.
Episode.
1959.
Okay.
So yeah, he's been in the business for quite a while, but his approach was not to work through the traditional studio system, but rather to have his own independent production company and then partner with studios for distribution and support.
That was kind of unusual for the day, I think you said.
It was a growing trend in the wake of some companies like blanking on the name. Shoot, they did 5 Easy Pieces, and BBS Studios was an early independent studio that produced a lot of really successful films, like 5 Easy Pieces with Jack Nicholson. Kind of made Jack Nicholson into a star, and won a bunch of awards with their movies. The Last Picture Show with Peter Bogdanovich was one of theirs.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of followed that mold and became an semi-independent filmmaker. He still worked with the studios a lot, and obviously the studios held sway with the distribution. But he basically made his strategy for, well, up till the present day, was to work very cheaply, to work fast. He became famous for only doing scenes in 1 or maybe 2 takes.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, a very down-to-business kind of approach to making movies. It was not one to dwell on the artsy-fartsiness of his work, which is refreshing. There's a kind of refreshing directness to Clint Eastwood movies, I find, that I enjoy.
Is that part of his just matter-of-fact kind of business style?
Yeah, I think it's part of his persona, because his heroes are kind of that way too. They don't say more than they need to. He's also famous for taking scripts, or receiving scripts, and taking a black marker or a pen and just scraping out, crossing out line after line of dialogue. Like, nope, we don't need that. Nope, we don't need that.
Do you think that was because of his history at Rawhide and television?
I've heard some commentators allude to that, yeah, because there's a lot of it's cheaper to say it than to show it. So, in television where budgets are concerned, the tendency can be to write something out and have them talk about it rather than show it. So yeah, it could be a reaction against that. I think it's also kind of just a minimalist style, a less is more principle that he's held to always. Definitely see it in this film.
Yeah. So the other kind of big deal in this film, and we talked about it quite a bit, we talked about The Wild Bunch, was the treatment of women. And obviously, as we've alluded to already, this film is pretty rough on women.
It is, and it's funny. I feel like The Wild Bunch and this movie, High Plains Drifter, both don't have a lot of female characters, which doesn't surprise me. Not just because of the time that it was made, but the time that it's set.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be unusual necessarily for there to be a town without many women, although there were certainly towns that had a lot of women. But this film feels much worse in its treatment of women to me than The Wild Bunch. That just could be my perception.
Well, I know Wild Bunch is one of your more favorite films, and you really
Yeah,
like
and I do have that bias.
I think the difference, though, is that in The Wild Bunch, women seem to be more as a side picture, more neglected. I think that they actually don't have a voice at all. Whereas in this film, their voice is used to kind of build up the main character. It's almost like they're being used rather than just ignored.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's also the kind of there's that aspect of it, but there's also the women of the town are the only ones who kind of whistleblow and challenge the menfolk to say, we need to do what's right, or we need to get rid of that gunslinger guy, or they're always there kind of providing a voice to try and push them in the right direction, or push them to take action when they're apathetic. So they definitely do have a voice, but at the same time, there's the kind of like sexual politics of it, which are abysmal.
Yeah, I mean, the one woman is being raped, and then towards the end of it, it almost appears like she's enjoying it, which is...
It kind of happens twice in this film.
Well, I guess that's true in regards to the innkeeper's wife.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that seems to be a theme throughout this film.
It's disturbing and unfortunate, and it really derailed the experience for me. Which I don't know what that says about me, that I could just enjoy the rowdy violence of the movie, but as soon as like sexual ethics come into play, then I'm like, eh.
Well, I don't know if they were very well handled in the film. Anyway,
what's that? The violence or the sex?
The sex,
right?
It's handled well in the film, whereas the ambiguity of the violence kind of makes it more intriguing and interesting.
Right.
The sex is kind of just like, yeah, they did this, and then we're going to go back to the main story. There's not a lot to draw that in with the story as well, and plus the way it's handled.
That's true. It doesn't really play into the story much. In particular, the first rape doesn't play into the story much at all.
You could have deleted that out of the film entirely.
Yeah, it just kind of, I guess it's just there to make him seem like a really bad dude.
Right.
Who takes what he wants from people who aren't in a position to fight back. But it definitely doesn't make him sympathetic, even though I feel like he should be, because he's kind of the Avenger, and we're kind of rooting for him to get justice. Yeah. But at the same time, by your interpretation, if he's the devil, then I guess that we're not rooting for anybody except for Mordecai.
I guess so. Although I guess if he was the devil, his attitude towards women makes a little bit more sense.
True. That's pretty much the only way you can square it. But yeah, that really took me out of the movie. Unfortunately, I don't think I enjoyed it as much as I would have if it hadn't been for that. At least with the second rape, there was sort of some dialogue between them that advanced the plot.
To be fair to Clint Eastwood, I think he said at a later time when he was interviewed that he probably wouldn't have done those scenes the way they did it. And currently,
right.
I don't know how much of a defense that is, but if you look at some of his later works, I think he doesn't handle things like that.
Yeah, and there is something to be said for young directors wanting to really push the boundaries I think Steven Spielberg is on the record. There's a scene in Jaws, which is, of course, one of his early successes, where a character is eaten by a shark early on in the story. And I think Spielberg's on record saying, when I was younger, I was more inclined to be brutal. And looking back on it, I wish I hadn't done that. And I guess, I don't know, but I guess that Clint Eastwood might feel the same way about some of the sheer brutality and the almost kind of like there's almost a kind of nihilistic tone to the film, a kind of bleakness, which fits right in perfectly with my view of 70s cinema. So in the 60s, you have this kind of new wave that happens with the downfall of the Hays Production Code. People start making more explicit movies in pretty much every area, and there's a lot of freedom that filmmakers have to express themselves that they didn't have before because of the rating system and just a generally more permissive sense of the times. But in the wake of the 60s, there was kind of this cultural movement of peace and love can solve things, and then peace and love didn't solve things, and there was a lot of trouble throughout America and the world with things like Martin Luther King being assassinated, and I'm sure you'll get into all that when you delve into the historical portion, so I don't mean to steal your thunder. But as it applies to film history, you have this moving from the sense of permissiveness kind of gradually into a sense of pessimism. So the dominant mood of the 70s was definitely pessimism. There's a lot of there was a collection of 70s sci-fi on the Criterion Channel streaming service, and they were nearly all dystopian futures. So there was this very bleak idea of the end of the world, of World War III. People were talking about Russia and the U.S. getting into nuclear war, and just a general sense of downbeat movies. And this film was written by, what's his name? Ernest Tidyman, who also is famous for writing The French Connection, which is a similarly bleak movie and a defining movie of that decade in many ways as well.
Right.
So it's a hard film to watch because of its lack of optimism. But there is a kind of, I guess the redeeming quality would be the search for justice, I guess. There is sort of a sense that justice gets done, but
in the end of the film,
but there's a kind of disquiet about it, for sure.
Well, that seems to be a segue into the history of the decade.
Da-da-da! See what I did there?
I see that. So the 1970s are very bleak, and kind of, well, let's just kind of go into this here for a second. Let me give you some statistics. So in 1970, a new house costs $23,400. By 1979, that house would have cost $58,500. So it goes up $2,500 in the course of less than 10 years.
$25,000?
$25,000.
Yeah.
The average income per year would be in 1970 is $9,350. In 1979, the income would be $17,550. So there is some increase in wages. But as you kind of look at these other few statistics here, you're going to see 1970 gallon of gas, 36 cents a gallon. 79, 86 cents a gallon.
Ooh.
So yeah, it more than doubles in less than 10 years. A new car would be $3,900 in 1970. In 1979, the car would be $5,770. So what's going on here is that wages do increase a little bit, but inflation way outpaces it. So in the 1970s, there is this energy crisis, but it's also an economic crisis, which we kind of understand, I think, in our current day. It's called stagflation. And the definition of stagflation is a term developed in the 1970s. Persistent high inflation combined with high unemployment and stagnant demand in country's economy.
Ouch.
Right. So typically, inflation doesn't have to be all bad. Usually inflation indicates that employment is up and the economy is strong and good. So, there's kind of this two lines going up, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what happened is that inflation was going up, while at the same time unemployment and the economy as a whole was going down. So it was a really kind of a weird thing that they hadn't seen before. Some of the reasons for the inflation part of it included Johnson trying to pay for Vietnam and his domestic policies for the Great Society without raising taxes. Seems like a pretty good idea, except that required to kind of print more money to continue on as usual, and when you print more money without adding any value to it, that creates inflation.
Ouch.
Also, in 1973, the Yom Kippur War starts. Of course, America supports Israel in this war, and the Arab allies don't like that so much, and they have control of OPEC. And OPEC, they raise prices on OPEC. The demand for oil in the U.S. continues to be the same. So if you have the demand for oil to remain the same, but the price goes up,
right?
Actually, the price will continue to go up because you need oil to transport oil, and with the price being exponentially going up. So that causes economic hard times. The whole the economy stagnation part of it kind of goes with the unemployment. Also during this time, the United States had been facing really great economy, at least since the World War II. They had just really strong sales, and they were selling to other countries, so they had really good, strong economy there. But what happens in the 70s is that they start facing competition on a global scale. So Japan and Germany are starting to import solid goods into the United States for a cheaper price. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons for that is that those countries' governments had supported them so that they could focus on producing a good product for a lower cost price.
Right.
American companies were kind of they were still, well, we weren't getting a whole lot of support from the government as far as that goes. And so they were kind of on their own trying to cut costs. And when you would do that, you try to invest in technologies that help you cut costs, and that can also cut jobs.
Right.
So unemployment happens. So Johnson tried to stop the inflation from going up. Nixon, of course, tried to handle this thing. But it continues on into Carter's administration. And the only thing that really kind of puts a hold on it and stops it is people being put back to work in the 1980s or stronger, when the economy gets stronger.
Right.
So
what led to that? What led to that turnaround, that boom in economic in the 80s? Upturn. I guess that's for next time.
That's for next time. I haven't gotten to that part yet. I've been researching what stagnation's all about.
Yeah.
You want to know about the hopeful part.
Sorry.
Tune in next time to hear the hope that comes in the 1980s.
Yeah, exactly.
But all throughout the 70s, there's this economic downturn, and it really kind of it's a very stressful time, I would imagine. We've lived through the 2008 recession, so you kind of, if you have a family or you have a house, or if you've just been alive during that time trying to get a job, you know the stress about trying to support yourself. Also going on during this time, of course, the Cold War has never gone away.
Right. So
nuclear proliferation is on everybody's mind in all the papers. So
basically,
in this time
companies or countries developing more and more weapons and just kind of stockpiling.
So, right. But actually, when Nixon comes to office, he's interested in a policy that will be called détente, which is kind of not necessarily peace, but definitely kind of cooling things down as far as this rivalry with the Soviet Union.
Right.
So Nixon will start it off in 1972. He goes to China.
Where only he could go, according to Kissinger.
Where only Nixon could go. Only Nixon can go to China. And that kind of smoothed things out with China. The Russians, not to be outdone by the Chinese, which of course, even though they were both communist nations, they're also major rivals as well. Nixon goes to Moscow in 1972 as well.
Wow.
So, yeah. So he's actually the first sitting president to ever visit Moscow. And this leads to later talks, or later negotiations, which will turn into SALT I, which is a limitation on nuclear weapons, and of course, nuclear negotiations for trade and space exploration and different things like that are discussed as well in these meetings. So SALT I, hopefully, the idea is that it limits that nuclear proliferation, the stockpiling of weapons. And that treaty negotiation will go from 74 to 77. So
gotcha.
Détente is not terrible. So there's kind of those things happening. If you look at Nixon's foreign policy, he doesn't do too bad of a job. If you look at it, he's got a very famous Secretary of State. His name is Kissinger.
Yes.
And very smart man. But he's often lumped in with Nixon because of another
controversial fellow also.
Also another, yeah. And one of the big controversies for the entire Nixon administration is something called Watergate.
Watergate, never heard of it.
Yeah. Well, it's this little thing about a hotel break-in.
I think they made a movie about this in the 70s.
There's a few. Well, I guess not in the 70s, but there's quite a few, at least films since then.
There is one very important movie about Watergate in the 70s.
All the President's Men?
All the President's Men. So,
Watergate, what actually happens there in 1972, there's five men are arrested for breaking into the Watergate Hotel to try to break into the Democratic election headquarters. And turns out that these guys were paid with funds from Nixon's re-election committee, which kind of goes up the ladder and eventually leads to Nixon being kind of implicated in it. And it goes on into Congress, where they finally kind of impeach him, or impeachment proceedings.
Yes.
Because he's trying to hide evidence. He's actually, apparently the White House is wired, is tapped, and they want the tapes to kind of see what's going on there, and he won't give them the tapes, and then so there's this big back and forth. And finally, the tapes are released, and just before the Senate would have probably, and many historians would say, probably would have given a guilty verdict, Nixon resigns. This whole thing kind of goes for 2 years, 72 to 73, right in the middle of that window of our film here. And
wow.
what this all does is really turns people off of politics. If not, and you can imagine, They turn away from politics. Many are out and out hostile towards politics, towards the government. They think they're out to get you. So their focus will go to kind of go to pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
What we saw in kind of the 1930s with the Great Depression, and you don't really want to see the world, so you go and see more escapist media, maybe some fantasy films.
Right.
Music becomes non-political, more love songs type thing.
Yep.
And even today, everything's called gate if it has
if
a
it's scandalous.
distinct
Yep.
scandal. Yeah. So those things, just to start it off, kind of make the decade not pretty.
It's a bit of a doozy of a decade. It's a pretty crazy time to be alive.
That's just the first part of it. Vietnam does end in 1975, but after years, at this time it's considered the longest war. It's like 16 years that they consider it 16 years. 1975, we finally pull out.
It's kind of a big loss of face for America.
It really is. So, foreign policy, foreign policy is not good. Domestic policy, not so good.
Yeah.
There's an economic downturn. I was just actually rewatching the Carter speech, Crisis in Confidence, which is what he called it. It's become quite famous as the Malaise speech, which was, I guess, his claim to fame. One anchor at CBS kind of said is the most, how did he say it, the most politically deaf speech ever made. So you can imagine how that makes people feel when you're just like, it's all your fault. We need to pull ourselves up from the bootstraps. And you're just sitting at home watching this and thinking, I thought I was trying to pull myself up from the bootstraps. I thought you were supposed to be there to help us. So the 70s are really tumultuous.
Full of turmoil.
Full of turmoil, thank you. Richard Nixon starts it off. He's elected 69, goes to 74 when he resigns. Gerald Ford picks it up and goes to 77. He's actually never elected to the presidency.
Again with the controversy.
He has a few controversial things himself.
The controversial pardoning of Nixon.
Very controversial. It actually, it was kind of hopeful when he takes over because his career in Congress, he was looked at as kind of a party man, but he was a straight shooter. A lot of people kind of looked at him as a straight shooter, very upright.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he pardons Nixon, and Ford says that he's trying to do this to get past Watergate, it really just lumps him in with Nixon.
Yeah.
And the stagnation of political corruption and all that.
Cynicism returns.
Exactly. Yeah. And kind of a similar thing, Jimmy Carter, he's kind of considered an outsider. He's a one-term governor from Georgia, and he comes in, and he promises a lot of things, but people quickly become disenchanted with him. A lot of his close cabinet members, close advisors, are all people that supported him in the campaign, are all from this United States South, or specifically in Georgia. The media kind of calls them the Georgia Mafia. So whether he means well, but even his perception is tainted.
Yeah.
Kind of idea. So the 70s, and you can kind of see 3 presidents in one decade is usually indicative of kind of a tumultuous time.
Mm-hmm.
But the 70s themselves are pretty interesting on the pop culture side of it. Do you know what the top grossing film in 1973 was?
In 1973?
1973, the same year our film is made.
I don't know.
Is The Exorcist.
Ah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's the top grossing film.
That was a huge film.
High Plains Drifter
again with the kind of bleakness.
Yeah, very and some supernatural ambiguity as well. High Plains Drifter drifts in at 17, though. It's not not necessarily the top grossing film.
Not a top grossing film, but it performed really well against its budget. I think it made back 3 times what it cost, if I remember rightly, which is pretty impressive.
So in 1970, the popular band was the Beatles, and they announced that they have disbanded.
No.
Yeah. Apollo 13 moon mission returns to Earth successfully after almost experiencing catastrophic failure. Great movie, Apollo 13.
Yep. That kind of brings a close. The 70s bring a close to the space program.
Space program
in
as
many
well,
ways.
Which,
although we still have a space program today, but
that also kind of plays into the stagnation thing. That's something the government is paying for that doesn't really have money to pay for. So it's kind of adding to that burden as well.
It's a double-edged sword, because part of what you were talking about with de-escalating conflict with the Soviet Union, that also led to kind of a slowdown in the space race, because that was kind of the driving force of getting to the moon, was we wanted to beat the Russians.
Yeah.
So once that started once you started to get international treaties and a lot of that agreement, the urgency disappeared and the economy tanks. And big slowdown in that development.
The also going on in 1970, the first jumbo jet, Boeing 747, makes its debut commercial flight from New York to London. Which kind of gives you kind of a weird feeling if you realize those 747s date back to the 70s.
I do get that feeling sometimes when I fly.
Anyway, but there's other stuff going on here. 71, the U.S. voting age is lowered from 21 to 18. The 26th Amendment passes.
It's a pretty big deal.
It is a pretty big deal. You also have to think about, in the 1970s, women's liberation is going on.
Very much
a lot
so.
of women are going to work. I guess that plays in maybe a little bit in what we were talking about in our film.
Yeah.
You have Walt Disney World Resort is opening in Orlando, Florida. So next time when Walt Disney World reopens, it will be there for almost 50 years.
Wow.
Yeah. The first microprocessor, the 4004, is released by Intel, and that kind of is the start of the computer age, I guess.
Yeah, I feel like people didn't really know at the time what they had on their hands, but it was kind of daunting in those days.
Pong is released in 1972.
Pong.
Yes, Pong and Atari, or Atari's Pong, I guess. Also 72, of course. Remember, this is Watergate going on there. 73, Yom Kippur War heightens tensions. Not so good for the Cold War. So they're trying to calm things down with SALT I, and then there's a major war in the Middle East. Mariner 10, space probe, NASA. A major event in 73 is Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
So the Supreme Court decision on abortion.
Huge issue.
Carried out in the 70s. It is a huge issue, and still continues to be a huge issue.
Yeah.
Debated at its time between cultural or social right versus social left. Billie Jean King beats Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes tennis match. There was a movie about that too.
Yep.
74, the UPC barcode is introduced.
Ah.
So imagine a world without the barcode.
It's hard to
If you're in
imagine
retail,
that now.
But yeah, if you were in retail, you know exactly what the barcode is all about there.
And
but that's
I think the ISBN comes out in the 70s too for books.
Really?
Another barcode that we didn't have. It might have been 16.9 or the early 70s.
Okay. So I didn't have that on here, but at this time the world's population is estimated to be 4 billion people.
Wow, look how far we've come.
I know, right? Compare that to, what is it, 7 billion right now?
Yeah.
1975, Vietnam War officially ends, according to the United States, at least the United States involvement in it.
Mm-hmm.
A movie by the name of Jaws opens in theaters.
I think I mentioned that earlier.
Yes, it's considered one of the first blockbuster films.
Yes.
And this is kind of maybe another full circle thing I may have mentioned in one of our, was that second episode, about what inspired Jaws? Certain shark attacks happening in the 1910s.
We did talk about that, yeah.
Sony introduces the Betamax videotape.
Yep, another game changer in the entertainment world.
It's true. Bill Gates and Paul Allen create Microsoft. And then the popular late-night sketch show Saturday Night Live airs for the first time in 1975.
Wow.
Yes, and if I read my notes right, the first president that show parodies is Gerald Ford.
Starting a great legacy.
A long tradition.
Long tradition of making fun of people in the highest office in the land.
In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak create the Apple Computer Company. NASA will introduce the first space shuttle, which is the Enterprise, after a certain television program ship.
Man, what a decade for pop culture, right?
Right. The first commercial Concorde flight takes place, 1976.
Yeah.
In 77, Panama Canal is returned to Panama from the United States. Jimmy Carter will become president in 77.
That was kind of the Panama Canal, that was kind of a controversial matter too, wasn't it?
It's very controversial.
A lot of people thought we shouldn't have done that.
Well, not south of the border anyway. Here in the United States, a lot of people were considering, like, we shouldn't give up our strategic advantage that we have there in controlling that vein from the Pacific to the Atlantic. But in many countries in South America and Central America, it was viewed as something, as a token of good faith. It was a first step, because the United States and the Central and South American countries have had kind of a long history of the United States really being patronizing them, being patronistic.
Yes.
So they kind of looked at that and saw, well, maybe that's a step in the right direction. So controversial on many levels, but it does turn. Control is turned over in 1977. I believe Jimmy Carter, one of Jimmy Carter's first things that gets passed under his presidency, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken on that one. MRI, the magnetic resonance imaging scanner, is first tested. It's become a kind of a big deal.
Yes, definitely.
A certain movie of really no consequence is released on May 25th, 1977.
Smokey and the Bandit?
No, it takes place in the galaxy far, far away.
Saturday Night Fever?
That's it. That's the movie. Actually, that is released in, I think, 76, which is 77. That's a big deal, too.
Yeah, it's a big year
of course,
for movies.
This is Star Wars, of course, which is I think the biggest film in the 70s, in the 1970s,
Yep.
I think.
So a very hard turn there from the kind of bleak and expressionistic and dark cinema to the very escapist, very light adventure, family-friendly fare.
Yeah. I mean, Jaws in 75, I guess, starts it a little bit, but 77, it's all there in the fantasy world.
Jaws definitely pulls the switch, because before that, the biggest grossing movie was The Exorcist.
Right.
And then Jaws kind of reels it back in.
No pun intended, or is that a pun?
Well, a little bit of a pun there.
You totally meant to do that.
And then Star Wars really lands the plane into the kind of, and also cements the blockbuster distribution model, which is to kind of a different kind of release pattern. So that's kind of become standard practice even to this day.
Now that might be changing now.
It is gradually
with the
changing
whole
now.
The streaming model.
It is changing now somewhat, but the release for theatrical films more or less hasn't changed a whole lot. The difference now is that there's a whole lot more screens than there used to be.
Well, I guess that could be true. I'm not up on my screening policies, I guess. I was thinking it was a big difference now because of theaters closing for the coronavirus.
Right. Now, as in right this moment, things are quite exceptionally different. But in general, the kind of like movie releasing practices that Star Wars kicked off, and in many ways the way that Star Wars was marketed and the way that it released to videotape, and kind of like setting the standard, like when there's talk about a new format like DVD or Blu-ray coming to the fore, Star Wars is one of those titles that's kind of a evergreen and a standard for what will be. And when Star Wars came out on streaming or on digital, that was kind of like a landmark. So in many ways, Star Wars set new standards that are still in place today. It's one of those movies. It's definitely if you were to look at it as a trail, seeing as this is a Westerns podcast, and you were traveling from Kansas City to Oregon, you would definitely see Star Wars as one of the signposts along the way.
Yeah. And it would lead you back to the 1970s.
It would indeed.
So 1978, Garfield comic strip debuts. Those of you who love Garfield. Israel and Egypt signed the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords. That's a major coup for Carter. The computer video game Space Invaders is released. So we're talking about the computer age and video games at large. I think that's probably the biggest name in video games, if I'm not mistaken. And then 79, the 3 Mile Island nuclear incident occurs, which I can't imagine really helps the whole energy crisis that much.
No.
The Walkman is introduced by Sony, and Michael Jackson's solo debut album is released.
Wow.
Yeah. So it is a big deal in the 1970s.
Lots of changes over the course of that decade.
Yeah.
It's a very changing time.
Well,
thank you.
Did you have any?
Thank you, Chris, for your keen analysis as always.
Have an overview of the 1970s.
Yeah, that was a good. There's a lot there that we could talk about, but I don't think that we have time to delve into all of it.
No, I think not. Very interesting, though. Thank you for sharing about High Plains Drifter.
Yeah, thanks for being part of it. And thank you, dear listener, for joining us once again for another episode in our Westerns by the Decade series. If you like this series, or if you like this episode and it's your first time, go back and check out some of the others we've done. We did the 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, 10s.
Teens and...
Knots.
Aughts. The aughts.
The aughts.
The aughts.
We ought to have done.
So, almost, we've come a long way.
We have indeed.
So next time, we're doing the 80s. Should we announce what we plan to do in the 1980s?
Yes,
or are we gonna,
Chris, I think we
should we hide it in case we change our minds again?
We're not changing our minds this time.
Okay. I'm pretty excited about this film. I've never seen it before. It's called Silverado.
You've never seen it before?
I've never seen this film.
Oh.
So I'm pretty excited about it. Have you seen this film?
I have not. I thought it was one of your favorites.
No. I've seen parts of it on TV, and I've read about it, but I've never actually seen it.
Okay.
It's kind of from my understanding, it's kind of a throwback to the classic Western that you may have seen. You probably would have seen in the early '60s into the '50s.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of excited about it.
Yeah, you would think there would be more throwbacks to escapist type Westerns of the 50s and 60s. What with the advent of kind of popcorn movies coming back into vogue.
Right.
But
So that doesn't really happen until the '80s.
It doesn't really happen that way. But yeah, we'll talk about that more next time.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
So, see us on Twitter and Instagram.
Yes, we're on all those
YouTube,
places.
Which reminds me, Ben just released a video on YouTube on Cinemarionette. Am I saying that right?
Cinemarionette.
Cinemarionette. Check that out. It's about puppetry and its impact on culture. It's very good.
Yes, it's on the Cinemarionette YouTube channel, and it'll be up on the Popstorian YouTube channel as well. So go and check that out.
And of course, we're on Facebook. So let us know what your favorite 70s song, movie, theme, where we got it wrong, where we got it right. Let us know what you think of the podcast.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Did we say our email address?
Oh, we didn't.
There's so many ways to get in touch with us. It's
of course, www.popstorian@gmail.com.
Only without the www.
Right.
If you put www. In the email address, it won't get to us.
I was reverting back to my 90s days, where you actually had to put that in the internet.
We don't want to go back to our 90s slang, Chris.
Okay. Check that episode out, too.
That'll be our first hate mail.
Like, I tried to get a hold of you, but you gave us...
I was just trying to be jiggy with it. Oh, man.
Gave you a bum steer. Alrighty, then.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.
You have a very good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Popstorian podcast. Be sure to subscribe. You can find us online at popstorian.com or on Facebook and Twitter. Tune in next time for more of the history of popular culture.